Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us in IBFIM's 7th webinar series. I am Azrin Shahida, your moderator for this session. Before we begin, I would like to give a gentle reminder for all participants to please mute your microphone and disable your camera while the session is on, so we can avoid any interruption from movements and background noises. Our session will commence with a presentation by our speaker and followed by question and answers with participants. If you have any questions on today's topic, please type it in the chat box and they will be addressed at the end. The topic for today's session is the COVID-19 pandemic is caused by our disregard of nature and animals. How can the financial sector play a role to avoid future incidents? As we may have come across in the news, COVID-19 falls in the list of infectious diseases alongside Ebola, swine flu, Zika virus, amongst others, with origins from animals and subsequent transmission to humans. To quote an article written by David Quammen in the New York Times, "We cut the trees, we kill the animals or cage them and send them to markets. We disrupt ecosystems and we shake viruses loose from their natural hosts. When that happens, they need a new host, and often we are it." If anything, the present crisis is giving us an example of how pandemics may be a side effect of economic development. This may be the first time most of us are experiencing a pandemic in this scale, but it may possibly not be the last, and that is the future that we have to prepare for. We have with us this morning Mr. Alizan Mahadi, Senior Fellow and Head of the Technology, Innovation, Environment and Sustainability Division at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, to share with us his insights on the relationship and importance of nature to the economy, as well as what role can the financial sector play to avoid or mitigate risks of future outbreaks. To briefly introduce our speaker, Mr. Alizan previously served as the Special Officer to the Science Advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia and the Chair of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Mr. Alizan has an MSc in Sustainable Development from the University of Uppsala, Sweden, and is currently completing his PhD at the School of Media and Governance at Keio University, Japan, on understanding the influence of Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, to address interlinkages across SDGs. Mr. Alizan's full profile is displayed on the screen. Once again, just before we start, please ensure that all your microphones are on mute and your camera is disabled. With this, I pass the session over to Mr. Alizan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Azrin, for the introduction. And Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera and a very good morning to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank IBFIM for inviting me today for this discussion on the link between importance of nature to the economy. Now, I think this COVID-19 has brought up a kind of reminder about our link between nature and our livelihoods. There's this narrative, I think many of you probably have seen, that there is a kind of return to nature or return of nature where you see wildlife roaming in empty cities, you see clean rivers, etc. Now, while that may be a very encouraging sign, however, it is a bit more complicated than that. Firstly, I think after the lockdown periods are over, we may see a back to normal, although this is a new normal, a back to normal in terms of the pollution levels, etc. So nature requires quite a long time to recover. So what we need to understand is what really is the link between nature, the economy, our livelihoods, and perhaps today I will try to unpack that a little bit. So my presentation is on importance of nature to the economy, mitigating future outbreaks and strengthening resilience. So to do that, I have just three simple outlines for my presentation. I'll first go through the link between nature and economy and livelihoods. And COVID-19 sets as a very good reminder and a case study, if you like, about what that link is in concrete terms. Secondly, I will look into a bit on the COVID-19 responses, on the current and likely policy and economic responses, and I'll end up with touching briefly on the financial responses and the role of the financial sector. Okay, firstly, there is the need to understand the holistic and systemic nature of environment, of biodiversity. When we talk about nature, we often talk about biodiversity. Biodiversity, we talk about the variation of life at genetic level, at the species level, such as wildlife, and ecosystems level, such as forests. Now, we have to understand that biodiversity is what people call sometimes the web of life, the life support system, etc. And it is linked throughout every part of our livelihood. So we need to understand biodiversity and nature from this holistic and systemic view. Saying that, I think holistic, systemic, etc., has been a bit of a buzzword in recent years. So what does that exactly mean? So we need to unpack it a bit and zoom in further. And there we need to understand what are the interlinkages of biodiversity of nature across various issues. And not only the interlinkages across all issues, we need to start prioritizing and understand what are the crucial interlinkages between them rather than just speak at this holistic systemic level. And from there, we will start to understand what are the interrelated risks among them. So recently, of course, there's the interest in the link between biodiversity, nature, and human health. When you look into that, for example, this is prepared neatly by the World Economic Forum, we start to see some areas that are very interrelated with between biodiversity and health, for example, issues of forests, future of health and healthcare, future of food, mental health, climate change, global governance, biotechnology, cities and urbanizations, sustainable development, as well as what is being spoken about now, especially is global health. So we try to unpack what are those linkages. Wider than that, we also need to understand the contribution and the linkages between biodiversity, nature, and development issues. And one important thing that I would like to bring up here is that COVID-19 is more a symptom of unsustainable development rather than um, a people talk about the new normal now. The link between biodiversity and development is quite important, and it's not going to be only COVID-19. There will be various other uncertainties happening around the world linked to nature and biodiversity, and therefore COVID-19 is merely a symptom, and we may see future, not only pandemics, but future crises occurring more and more frequently. Nonetheless, COVID-19 does provide a good case study in really understanding what is those linkages in concrete terms. So let me just illustrate that for you. Okay, first of all, I think we all know COVID-19 has spread to virtually almost everywhere in the world except for some Pacific island states and so on. I think only 15 countries that have officially said there is no COVID. Even that sometimes is due to a lack of testing. And we know that it is caused by transmission between humans, human-to-human transmission through droplets, fomites, possibly aerosol. Let's confirm. Possible fecal or oral route, but we know that there's this human-to-human transmission. Yet we speak a bit less about the origin of COVID, and while this is not yet fully agreed, the leading hypothesis is that it's a zoonotic transmission, which means that it is passed from animals to humans. And the leading hypothesis, as I said, was first it came from bats, and then it transmitted to pangolins as intermediary, because there is a similar coronavirus found in pangolins, almost identical, and that is ultimately transmitted to humans. So I think we need to really speak about this equation as well. On top of that, we also don't speak too much about the drivers between this link between the zoonotic transmission and human-to-human transmission. And here it has links to do with wildlife consumption, wildlife trade, habitat destruction as well, because there's a lot of habitat destructions of the wildlife, which I'll get into a bit later, and as well the demand from the consumers, as well as the population dynamics, because the population dynamics, perhaps if this happened, I don't know, 50 years ago, it wouldn't be as widespread as now, but due to the population growth of the world and also the interconnectivity of the world, people traveling everywhere. And as you can see, that has led to the COVID-19 spreading virtually across the world. Okay, so let me break it down a bit into these different components. Firstly, the more direct components, and secondly, the more indirect components. Directly, as I mentioned, it was to do with wildlife. The zoonotic diseases were to do with wildlife trafficking and wildlife trade. Here, the spread of zoonotic diseases is exacerbated by trafficking, markets, habitat destruction, and climate change. And these threats drive humans and animals into closer proximity. So many people are calling for permanent bans on both consumption and wildlife trade. Now, just for your information, since 2016, CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Species and Wild Fauna, has banned the trade of penguins since 2016. Malaysia is signatory to it. Nonetheless, of course, we still see pangolins being traded, and in fact, the studies show that the Malayan pangolin is most likely the intermediate carriers of COVID-19, the coronavirus. And this is the main suspect, if you like, for the transmission. And here, unfortunately for Malaysia and Southeast Asia, we act as both the source of pangolins as well as the hub for the trafficking of wildlife in general and of pangolins. So directly, we have to really look into the issue of wildlife trade and wildlife consumption. But wider than that, we also have to think about habitat protection rather than just wildlife trade, because this is from a study undertaken by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. For those following climate change, you may have heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. This is essentially the IPCC for biodiversity, which brings together scientists and governments across the world to produce authoritative and consensus between scientific results. And here, with high consensus, they produced a report last year, an assessment, a global assessment on biodiversity, and proclaimed that nature is the origin of most infectious diseases, which is of course a negative thing, but also the source of medicines and antibiotics for treatment. So biodiversity and nature provides both a positive and negative to human health, and of course positive if preserved. Zoonotic diseases are significant threats to human health, with vector-borne diseases accounting for approximately 17% of all infectious diseases and causing an estimated 700 deaths globally per annum. So we cannot say that this is an unknown. In fact, there are various scientific articles that already predicted this pandemic, and some are very. I think there was a 2007 paper which in detail accurately predicted this issue of in southern China could be a time bomb with their wildlife consumption and wet markets. Um, Emerging infectious diseases in wildlife, domestic animals, plants, or people can be exacerbated by human activities such as land clearing, habitat fragmentations, or the overuse of antibiotics driving rapid evolution of antibiotic resistance in many bacterial pathogens. So here is just to demonstrate that we really need to look into the issue from a biodiversity and ecosystem services perspective and a habitat protection perspective, not just the wildlife trade, not just the wildlife consumption itself. Now, just to make it even more concrete and show the complex nature of the issues, and in Malaysia, we unfortunately have the experience in this, and that can be illustrated, for example, through the Nipah virus. So what happened in the Nipah virus for 2 decades or so, the forest habitat of the bats in Southeast Asia has been reduced by deforestation, pulpwood and industrial plantation in particularly, and then in 1997, 98, there was a lot of slash and burn, especially in Indonesia, and this was exacerbated by El Nino, which brought dry conditions. So this series of events led to reduction in the availability of flowering and fruiting forest trees for foraging by fruit bats and culminated in unprecedented encroachment into cultivated fruit orchards. So coupled with the location of the piggeries which were near the um, near the forest, etc., it allowed for transmission of the Nipah virus in that year. So here you can see once again, there's a clear link between the destruction of the habitat as well as the encroachment across different species, really, which in this case was bats as well as farming in terms of the piggeries. Just as a side, even malaria, there was a study that demonstrated that the rise in malaria, for example, due to being deforestation, etc., the cost of it to our healthcare is higher than the cost of any benefits accruing from that deforestation. Okay, so on a more global level, what this means is that there's been a huge uh, loss of biodiversity. Firstly, at the species level, the extinction rate is estimated to have increased tenfold. Before it was about 1 per million species, now it's about 10 million per million species, and it is estimated to have fallen by about 20%. This is just the estimate. We don't really know how much biodiversity there is around. There's a lack of information on this because there are millions, if not billions of species around the world, so it's very difficult to measure. But also on the loss of ecosystems, which is related to the habitat protection, 75% of land surface has been altered, 85% of wetlands have been lost. Even recently, where the tropics have suffered less deforestation, still 32 million hectares of primary or recovering forests in the tropics were lost between 2010 and 2015. And what this means is there's impact to the biosphere integrity, which is beyond the safe operating space of humanity. If you look into the chart there, this is what you call planetary boundaries. There are different issues such as climate change, ozone depletion, ocean acidification. The two areas which are beyond the zone of uncertainty, those orange areas, are those connected to biodiversity, which is biosphere integrity and biogeochemical flows. We may always focus on issues of climate change, which we should, but then we often forget to focus on biodiversity, which is which is a host to our nature, essentially. And what it says here is that the level of biodiversity loss has affected our livelihoods and our ability to operate safely in our lives. Okay, so what are the consequences to that? I think everyone knows and has seen more or less. This is yesterday, it changes every day, that COVID has spread around the world. There's more than 3 million cases now. There's more than 200,000 deaths. In the United States alone, it's about 60,000 deaths, which I've read is more than the fatalities in the Vietnam War. And the key thing here is when we look at the overall picture, I think, of course, everyone understands it as a health crisis, but as the saying goes, prevention is better than cure. But it could have been prevented. This disaster could have been prevented if we paid more attention to the wildlife protection. And of course, there's consequences to the economy as well. At the global level, it has resulted in world stocks crashing, oil price crashing. China has had a slowdown for the first time, I think, in decades. I think from even the 70s, it has had the worst slowdown, and countries like that trade with China and countries that generally trade, like Malaysia, are some of the most affected. So from a Malaysian perspective, on the left there is an estimate by the World Bank where, depending on the different scenarios and baselines, it is expected that Malaysia's economy will of course go under recession and contract by 0.1% or minus 4.6%. And that in turn will of course hit various sectors. And here from my colleague in ISIS Malaysia, who has estimated some of the business sectors that have been badly hit by MCO, such as food and beverages, fisheries, accommodation, of course, hotels, even forestry, animal rearing, etc. And that in turn, and we have to always remember this, will hit the workers very badly, and that will result in unemployment, unpaid leave, reduced pay leave, reduced hours, and ultimately reduce income and challenge in terms of livelihoods. So what is the responses, the current and likely policy responses and economic responses to this COVID-19? I think we also have to speak about the likely responses because they're still ongoing for now. Okay, again, I will kind of zoom in and zoom out and across the different issues. And for addressing the issue of wildlife itself, the policy responses here is likely to be, well, the Chinese government has already banned wildlife trade and consumption on February 24, so we will see if that continues to hold up. Initially, wildlife farming industry was created because of poverty, especially in the south where they did not have access to meat. Of course, at that time, China did not really trade with other countries. But that also now kind of blew up into illegal wildlife trade and so on into the wet market. So there's been a ban, which is supposed to be a permanent ban. We may see stricter enforcement of wildlife trade. Hopefully that will happen, but we will see in those terms. I think there's been an outrage also with this issue, so we might get consumers to demand more in terms of traceability, knowing where their products come from, etc. And we may see habitat protection as a higher priority, but I'll come back to that. I actually haven't seen much talk of that yet, and I'll come back to that. That's why. So in terms of, again, habitat protection and biodiversity preservation, I think from this lockdown, many people have shared the beautiful impact to nature. Even this is in Sungai Melaka and in Penang, you see green rivers rather than polluted rivers and so on. But that is really, well, it really shows how our impact is to nature. But I think when the MCO eases, when we open up, I think we really have to think about this more systemically, because this was not due to specific policy changes for protection of biodiversity. So it's more of a question, or many questions I have there. Will there be more focus on conserving the habitats of wildlife? I'm not sure. Will interspecies social or physical distancing be enforced? Again, I'm not sure. Um, we require well-respected boundaries for all wildlife, and perhaps we need to increase the protected areas perpetuity. Now it's about 10.8%. So this is the type of discussion we need to speak of, and again, I'll come back why that is difficult. Okay, when we talk about the responses, I think we all also have to be clear that the responses can be broken down into a few different areas. When we talk about responses, a lot of people talk about the MCO or lockdown across the world, but that is really the short-term response to suppress transmission and safeguard lives. In the next few years, we'll be talking about economic recovery, and this is mostly for areas such as social inclusion, cohesion. In the long term, we want to talk about sustainability. So we have to look into the responses in its overall context. So quick look at the responses in the context of Malaysia. In terms of the short term, I think everyone knows this already. We've seen some socio-economic responses in particular, of course, health measures, the MCO, as I mentioned. There's some responses in terms of education and the economic responses in terms of the various Prihatin packages, which amounted to about 250 billion ringgit. But what is important to understand is a lot of these short-term responses, which personally I think they are very good responses, but they really are to keep afloat really the economy, to ensure that the workers, etc., have some safety net in terms of income. But this is not yet a long-term solution. So I think the Prime Minister also recently in his recent address also spoke about the economic recovery plan, and this is being hotly debated at the moment. Now the challenge here is that we can look into short-term or long-term plans. In terms of the short-term, it might focus on social income protection, focus on protecting and recovering existing sectors, and it could focus on bailing out existing large corporations. Now the challenge to that is some of the long-term plans may be you can say compatible with the short-term plans, but in reality, some of them won't be. For example, you might want to focus on emerging sectors rather than bailing out existing companies, existing sectors, etc. So it is kind of an opportunity, but it's really a challenge to balance these two. And you can see this, for example, in terms of even in Europe, they spoke about a Green Deal. This was even before COVID-19, but now they are trying to negotiate as well. How do you achieve both the Green Deal as well as achieving this Green Deal post-COVID as well? Just on the side, I've been involved in various discussions with groups of experts, parliamentarians, etc., on really drafting out a sustainable, healthy, and resilient economy as part of work. So another part is about a lot of people have been speaking about changing economic models. I think, and this, when we stay home reflecting, a lot of people have brought up that perhaps the economic model needs to be changed, especially the neoliberalism model, which is linked to globalization. Free market is currently being challenged. Some people have brought up the donut economics model, which Netherlands has been championing, and this is focusing on understanding that there are certain limits to the consumption that the human activity can make. And as I mentioned earlier, this is based on the planetary boundaries, where you go above those limits, you incur, you go beyond a safe operating space for humanity. And the focus here in the future economic models is about building a resilient economy to shocks. And this means looking simply about what you call flows, consumption, production, but really looking to the amount of capital we have, amount of wealth, etc. Right, I have to speed up a bit as I'm losing time, but my last part is regarding the financial responses and the role of the financial sector. Firstly, in terms of the private sector, I think um, there might be a shift in the view of private sectors. ESG and sustainable related funds are performing very well, actually, in comparison with others during the crisis. And this is from my friend Farouz from the UN Global Compact shared this, where it shows that FTSE for good companies are outperforming the non-FTSE for good companies. So it's too early to say why this is the reason. Maybe these companies are more resilient. Maybe the consumer demand still holds up. But again, the importance here is that companies that are more resilient perhaps is the way forward in the future. Um, One of the key things, both for private sector and the financial sector, is really that there's a big change in the risk profiles moving forward, and this is what we call the new normal. There's a change in terms of physical risk, and COVID-19 has demonstrated that strongly, where there are actually physical impacts which bring about environmental impact, but there are also transition risks as well, because I think we have to understand that it is real. Issues of biodiversity loss, even climate change, is real. So there are going to be policy changes, and um, this will change markets as well. So there'll be new policies, there will be new models, etc. As I mentioned, will bring consumer demand changes, economic model transformations, and globalization and international trade changes in the future. So what can the financial sector do directly? Firstly, directly related to wildlife trade is to combat illicit financial flows. I won't go into too much detail on this, but wildlife and timber crime is estimated to earn organized crime about 8 to 10 billion annually, and unfortunately, Malaysia is again unfortunately quite high in terms of illicit capital flight, and illegal wildlife trade has been mentioned. So the most simple is to really combat illicit financial flows. Um, but I think the key thing is to mobilize finance, and um, the challenge with what I've been presenting, nature, biodiversity, is a bit more of a challenge to mobilize uh, finance for biodiversity protection. But now we have something bigger, I would say, something more mainstream, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. Um, Here, often development issues are funded by governments, by official development assistance, and so on. But that is not enough. There's a funding gap globally of about 2.5 trillion US dollars per year. So there's a need to scale up this finance. But here, I think we really need to understand when we talk about finance, we need to match it with the impacts that it provides. And this is the challenge we have globally, because it requires a clear taxonomy criteria and impact evaluation. And that in turn requires the capacity, mission critical knowledge by the financial sector itself. Um, and with that, we can perhaps move on to mobilizing the finance, especially from private and capital markets for this. Um, in Malaysia, that we've seen, especially, there's been, well, internationally and in Malaysia, there's been movement, especially in terms of bonds. There's SDG bonds, there's green Sukuk, etc. And this has been going across the world, and it's a very good way forward because of it giving a certainty of where the money is going, because it's real projects, etc. Um, this is also in line, of course, with Sharia compliance, etc. Um, Development banks and development financial institutions will play a major role as intermediaries in the futures to really mobilize the funding, because they have the government backing and high credit rating. But one thing I would like to caution here is often these green bonds we have been speaking about is purely for climate change. Now, biodiversity is a bit different, because biodiversity is about preservation. It's not really about managing, or it's not really about creating asset creation. So here, a lot of the bonds goes into projects which are perhaps, for example, renewable energy. So we really need to think about biodiversity finance, really keeping our forests, to put simple. How do we finance that? And it has to go beyond public finance as well. Okay, just my last slide here. In conclusion, there has been positive environmental impact during the MCO and lockdowns across the world. And this really, if anything, it shows that human activity really has been the main driver of our change within the environment in the past couple of years. So the good news there is that because we know that, we can see that, it means that we can also do something about it. Nature, biodiversity, and environment impact goes beyond health, but also economy and livelihoods, as I've shown clearly. So the idea here is really, once again, about resilience. We need to build a more resilient future, and sometimes we need to just keep nature where it is, and that will ensure resilience in the future. Physical risks are increasing with more uncertainty in the future. This is the new normal. So finance institutions will need the knowledge, the capacity to understand the complex nature of the risks, because they are highly complex. And one thing that I not fear, but now everyone is afraid of pandemics, but we can't focus everything on the pandemics because the next crisis may be a result of something else. But we need to understand the complex interrelation of the risks. In terms of transitional risk, this will be crucial as there will be many policy and demographic transitions and transformations in times of crisis. We've seen from history that there often is transformation. So we don't want to be left behind. We have to be progressive and understand that these changes are real, they are occurring, and societies respond to the new normal. And finally, financial institutions have a role to play to respond to future risk, of course, but also quite importantly, to influence the outcomes that are desirable for the future, not only to address the risk, but financial institutions have a real influence to carve out the way that we want to go into development in the future. And this is clear, and especially I'm happy IBFIM has invited me, because I think Islamic finance, for example, has a role to play, looking into financing that is more values-based, of course, rather than purely the old way of doing things. And that concludes my presentation. Sorry if I took a bit of extra time. Azrin, can I pass it back to you?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Alizan, for the presentation. Okay, in the interest of time, we will have about 15 minutes of Q&A. We already have some questions here in the chat box. If there are more, please type it down. I will just get on to the first question. We had an earlier question on what can Islamic financial institutions do to mitigate future incidents. But I believe this has been addressed in your presentation, or you could give further suggestions. Alizan?
Okay. Yes, I mean, well, a caveat. I'm not Islamic finance expert myself, so I hope my presentation paves the way for solutions from the Islamic finance industries. But the key thing I'm pointing out here is, firstly, is the risk profiles. I think the assessment of risk has to be more nuanced, more in-depth, and more understanding the interrelated physical risks, as I mentioned, and transition risks in the future. First of all, I think across the board, we really need that understanding when we talk about risk. Related to that, I think there needs to be a real focus on this. So there needs to be capacity building in financial institutions for assessment of finance related to this, because the problem is, in reality, various projects that are related to environmental preservation, etc., may not be, in its first instance, the most profitable in conventional terms. Now, how do you then assess the risk, etc.? So I think when you look into the contributions it provides to development, etc., then it becomes more profitable. And this is what is happening across the world through changes in taxonomy, etc. But of course, it will require different vehicles working together with development financial institutions. So there needs to be innovative solutions. I'll be happy to work with others on this, but it requires that cross-fertilization as well, I think. I'm not the person well placed to advise on that, but I'll be happy to work with financial experts to see how that can be resolved.
All right, thank you. The next question is, based on your experience, how is the response of Malaysia's private sector when it comes to financing biodiversity or habitat protection projects? Or is it still largely through the use of public funds?
Okay, thank you for the question, and that's a very good question. It's across the world, really. It is still largely across public funds. One thing you have to understand in the context of Malaysia is biodiversity protection is often related to land use. Well, it is related to land use, especially habitat protection, and land is a state matter. So often it uses state coffers, so it depends on the affluence of the state, it depends on the governance of the different states, etc. So um, firstly, it's mostly funded by government, and quite a lot of it is at the state level. In terms of private sector, I think there's been efforts, for example, planting trees, etc. But there hasn't been large scale for biodiversity protection. I haven't seen much of that yet. As I mentioned, I think when we talk about environment, I think there is a risk that we look into only one issue, and that issue has been climate change. And personally, to me, the context of Malaysia, even when you talk about climate change, what we have in Malaysia in comparison with the world is our tropical forests, and that also acts as a large carbon stock. So I think there needs to be a real focus to access private finance for biodiversity protection as well. But as I mentioned earlier, I do recognize that it's a bit different. It's a bit difficult as well because it's not like building a renewable energy project where there's a clear asset, etc. So again, it needs very innovative solutions.
All right. This ties in nicely with this other question, actually, is quite related. How do we shift the state's eyes from cashing out natural resources, i.e., timber for revenue, anticipating more logging when economy is picking up? Thank you.
I think firstly, we have, again, there needs to be that knowledge, first of all, the knowledge, the evidence. Um, for example, when you talk about deforestation, the impacts of it's very complex, but if you take climate change, which brings more intense storms, rain events, flooding, um, areas which have suffered from deforestation will most likely suffer more because forests act as kind of natural sponges, really, um, and and therefore the impacts to that economically is worse than the deforestation itself. So first of all, I think there has to be a real measurement of economic value of forests rather than the income from the timber products itself. Secondly, of course, the challenge with our federal system is we can't also run away from politics, and sometimes the states which have not been funded, they require revenue, and therefore they well they get revenue from wherever they can, which is including deforestation, etc. So I think there needs to be a real national level conservation plan, conservation. There's things called payment for ecosystem services, where at the national level, perhaps the national level will have to pay for the conservation of forests for the ecosystem services that they provide. And ecological fiscal transfers, etc. So that there are various mechanisms to conserve the forest, but that has to be really concentrated and really been taken seriously at the federal level as well, because I think if we leave it to the states as well, as states only, I think they might not have the means to to do it themselves.
Okay, sorry. Well, okay, again, this is also another related question. In your opinion, how far will our Malaysian government push forward with the green economy initiative following this crisis?
Um, it's really hard to anticipate, to be honest with you. Of course, the government is also very new, in a sense, and the objectives are still not clear yet. So it's very hard to anticipate. But Malaysia still is a developing country, and I don't want to be pessimistic here, but speaking with various people, I think there's been a worry that the easy way out is really to focus on the short-term issues. That's the easy way out, and this is what many developing countries will do, I think, in this economic recession period. But focusing on a green economy, I mean, I've showed in my presentation, even at the European Union level, there has been some debate, or quite a lot of debate, whether they should progress with their green economy model. And the reality will be some countries probably will, while others won't. So it's hard to anticipate. I would say it's hard to imagine, to be honest with you, and with in this time of recession where we have very short-term goals, where the situation of our finances as well has been spoken about a lot. But I hope there can be really serious consideration in this and find really win-win situations, perhaps the most cost-effective solutions in moving forward for a green economy.
Thank you. We still have a few more questions, if that's okay. The next question is from Mr. Haji. He wishes you Ramadan Kareem, and he's asking, how can you relate this social protection with the objectives of Sharia, Maqasid Sharia? Thank you.
Well, I think social protection is at the heart of it, because in Maqasid Sharia we speak about both the virtues, the goals, as well as the legal component of it. And of course, from the virtue component, from the goals, the social protection is very much aligned to the goals of poverty eradication of the society, etc. So I think it's very much in line. Also, in terms of in a way, equality as well. I've had quite a lot of, generally speaking, I've had quite a lot of discussions on social protection recently, because I work quite closely with various constituencies, parliamentarians, etc., and on this COVID-19 recovery. And I think there's a clear link there, whether the Maqasid Sharia or general, about the need for values-based, I would say, because there are people who are really suffering. And I think development generally has to move away from simply numbers and figures to a more value-based development. And I think in that sense, Maqasid Sharia can bring that component.
Thank you. Another question. From your observation, how much has there been a shift in capitalism due to COVID-19, or would things go back to business as usual?
Great question. I think everyone is looking at that now. No one can have I think, a concrete answer to that, because it's going both ways. Some are saying that it's dying a slow death, while some are saying that it's being reinforced during this time. I think the reality is capitalism, especially in the neoliberal form, has been on decline actually before COVID-19. And even when you have people like the presidency of Donald Trump, etc., it's more of a reaction to that decline more than anything else. This is my personal opinion. So I think COVID-19, in my opinion, has really demonstrated the limits to that ideology very clearly. In that sense, many people, many commentators across the world have demonstrated the differences between the reactions, for example, in the United States compared to East Asian countries, compared to China, Japan, even Malaysia, Singapore, and so on, where they have prioritized opening up uh, um, their markets and not closing down, etc. So I think that that narrative has been there. Now, post-COVID, what will happen? I think there might be a start of a change. Put it that way. It's not going to be straight away, but this may be a start of a transition. It might accelerate that transition to a new economic model. I don't think it will be abrupt. I don't think after all this suddenly there will be a change, but we've seen the different models coming up in Europe, for example. The donut economic model, for example, has been popping up, and we've seen that across various areas. So yes, it wouldn't be abrupt, but it may prop up firstly in a few countries, and if those countries are perhaps successful doing that, then other countries will adopt it and it will accelerate to a new model.
Okay, we have final two questions to Alizan. The first one is, based on your knowledge, how does population modeling and dynamics take into account when policies are made in Malaysia? Or if I could rephrase it, how is population modeling and dynamics taken into account when policies are made in Malaysia?
Okay, the honest answer to that is I'm not 100% sure how they're being taken into account. They are of course being taken into account, but it's a multi disciplinary, multi angle question you're asking there, because population dynamics are being taken into account as usual, but the question is, are they being taken account into the different demographic changes that are occurring? For example, the changes in terms of urbanization, the population to include non stateless and non-Malaysians and illegal immigrants, etc. Now, uh, you know, those are very important components that has to be taken into consideration. But again, I'm not an expert in terms of population dynamics, but the population modeling, from my understanding, is being taken into consideration. But perhaps they need to incorporate the different and new dimensions um, which are occurring in Malaysia. And from my understanding and my limited reading in that, we organized a few years ago something around population and development in general. That was the consensus. It has to be updated to the new population dynamics and drivers that are occurring around the world.
Okay, and the final question is actually from Ms. Sheila, seeking a comment on the decision by the US government to cut funding to WHO, which currently is mentioned at US $500 million annually. What is your comment on that?
Yeah, obviously, it's not the time to be cutting on funding for the WHO, as WHO plays an important role to coordinate the global response to COVID-19. So obviously not ideal, but my view is it's generally a wider plan from President Trump uh, to reduce Americans, well, to really not bring down, but really reduce the power of multilateralism. I mean, this has been consistent in Trump's uh, actions, and this includes wanting to come out from the Paris Climate Agreement as well. So it's very consistent in those terms, and perhaps he has just used this opportunity to reduce the funding from WHO. So from an international relations point of view, it's obviously not good for both COVID-19 response, but also from multilateralism, um, international organizations, roles, etc., which is now going into decline, really. And you need the leadership of countries like United States and China to uphold multilateralism. So it's a wider trend by the president of the United States. I think perhaps we will. Well, many commentators have said there has been that trend even before President Trump, to be honest, or United States support of multilateralism. So it's not entirely surprising for me. It may be just the timing. Timing is because this is the point where they need the funding the most. So of course disappointing.
Okay, thank you. I believe that this is all the time we have for questions. I think we took a bit more of your time actually, Encik Alizan. Thank you for that. So thank you very much again, Ms. Alizan, for all the knowledge shared. And thank you again to all the participants for joining us today.